Good evening, everyone, for joining in. I am Lieutenant Jillian Cabana, co-chair of the Westport Domestic Violence Task Force. And thank you for joining us tonight for When Stop Doesn't Work, What is the Impact on Our Children? The event is hosted by the Westport Domestic Violence Task Force with the Westport Department of Human Services and Domestic Violence Crisis Center in partnership with the Westport Public Library. And tonight we have Ann Rodwell-Lawton, Assistant Director of the Domestic Violence Crisis Center, presenting with Liz Modugno of Aspire Counseling right here in Westport to talk about the impact of trauma on children and child growth and development, particularly domestic violence trauma, the impact of that on child growth and development. At the end, we will have a question and answer session, and our panelists and our presenters tonight, will be joined by some additional panelists, including licensed clinical social worker Deirdre Eckel of the Westport Department of Human Services and licensed marriage and family therapist Erin Shannon of Aspire Counseling in Westport, as well as Dr. Wendy Levy, forensic psychologist. Thanks. And Ann, I guess we'll kick it over to you to get started.
Great, thank you so much, Jillian. Thank you everyone for tuning in. This is a really exciting night. I'm really happy to be here. Before we dive in, I just want to acknowledge that this can be some heavy content that might be upsetting or overwhelming. So we remind folks to take care of themselves during this time and afterwards. We are going to start by talking about some statistics to understand the prevalence of domestic violence and particularly around children. Before we dive in, just a little context to where I work, the Domestic Violence Crisis Center. We are the local domestic violence agency for Westport and Lower Fairfield County, and our services are free and confidential. So that is the lens and the perspective that I bring to this work. Okay. So we know that 1 in 4 women and 1 in 7 men in the United States have experienced physical violence by an intimate partner in their lifetime. So everyone knows someone who's been impacted by domestic violence in some way, whether you know it or not. We know that based on these statistics. It's also important to note that this statistic is just talking about physical violence. So when we look at other behaviors that are domestic violence, we would think that these numbers would increase. We also know that domestic violence is the leading cause of homelessness for women and children. And in the United States, 1 in 15 children are exposed to intimate partner violence. We will talk a little bit later about what that exposure looks like and what that means. We also know that children who witness domestic violence have long-term effects on children's physical and mental health. And so Liz will be talking later on a little bit more about that. And we also know that growing up in a home where domestic violence is present is the strongest predictor of a child becoming either a perpetrator or a victim of domestic violence later in life. So we call this the generational cycle of abuse. And so today we will wrap up by talking about how we can help and support children, what prevention looks like, what resources are available so that we can break that generational cycle. So what is domestic violence? Tonight, I will use the terms intimate partner violence and domestic violence interchangeably. Domestic violence refers to a pattern of abusive behavior in a relationship where one partner uses that behavior to maintain power and control. Now, some important things for us to remember when we're thinking about domestic violence is we're not talking about a one-time single isolated incident. We're talking about a pattern of behaviors, and these behaviors often escalate over time. So a relationship might start out healthy, and then over time, some unhealthy behaviors start to develop. Since this is a gradual escalation, victims and survivors often don't notice this change in their relationship, right? Because it becomes normalized to them. We also know that domestic violence is based in power and control. And this is really important to recognize because domestic violence is not based in anger. When we look at abusers' behavior, we can see that they have control over their actions. They control when they abuse. So when children aren't around, perhaps, they control how they abuse, so that bruises are left where they can't be detected. Right, so this behavior is rooted in one person wanting to have power and control over another. We also know that domestic violence can manifest as verbal, emotional, physical, financial, technological, or sexual in nature. And so verbal abuse is using one's words to hurt someone, whether that's belittling them or putting them down. We know that this then often ties into emotional abuse. Emotional abuse happens when victims and survivors start to believe what their abuser is saying about them. They start to believe that, and it affects their emotions, it affects their sense of self, and it affects their self-esteem. So if someone is told every day that they're stupid, worthless, and no one's going to love them, they're going to possibly start to believe that about themselves. And again, this affects their sense of self. And so examples of emotional abuse can be possessiveness, so treating victims and children like possessions. It can be blaming the victim for the abuser's behavior. So saying, well, if you had dinner on the table on time, I wouldn't have gotten upset. We also see isolation, which can happen both for the victim and the children, isolating them from their support systems, from friends and family. And then we also have gaslighting, which is making the victim feel like they're going crazy, second guessing themselves. Things like saying, an abuser could say, well, I didn't push you that hard, right? You're being over dramatic. So emotional abuse has long-term consequences for victims. It's very difficult to overcome. We then have physical abuse, which is what people often think about when they think of domestic violence, hitting, pushing, shoving, but it also includes the threat of physical violence, things like restraining victims, cornering them so they cannot leave, maybe locking them in a closet, locking a child in a closet. It can also be object aggression, throwing objects, destruction of property, that intent to instill fear in someone through that physical force. And also reckless driving is another example. So those are examples where maybe someone isn't physically touched, but that is physical abuse. We also have financial abuse, which we know occurs in 99% of domestic violence cases, and that is limiting victims' financial resources, making the victim dependent on the abuser. This then trickles down to the children as well. And we have technological and sexual abuse as well. So really important to recognize that we are not just talking about physical abuse, and we're thinking about domestic violence from this broad lens of all these different methods of control. And these are ultimately going to impact children. And then finally, assaulting, threatening, or stalking an intimate partner in the state of Connecticut is a crime. So where do children come into play with this? We know that victims use children to maintain power and control over victims. They use children to be able to get victims to do what they want. So we're going to talk about that a little bit more. So what might this look like? How are children used to maintain power and control? Just going to move this really quick. Here we go. So one way is making the partner feel guilty about the children, saying, if you really cared about the children, you wouldn't go out, or you would stay home and take care of them. Children are sometimes asked to relay messages to the other parent or to the other party. And then we see at the bottom here, we have different threats that can be used. And so these are threats that can be used to make the victim do what the abuser wants. Additionally, these threats can also be used once the relationship has ended. So we work with many victims who are divorced from their abuser, but they still have to co-parent with their abuser. And in having to communicate with them about the children, they are still harassed and threatened when it comes to visitation. They are continually threatened that the abuser is going to take custody of the children if they don't do what the abuser wants. And we know that abusers often utilize the court system more than victims. They have the financial resources to utilize the court system to try and get custody of the children, and often get there before victims have a chance to. So children are often used to maintain power control through all of these threats about taking the children from the victim. Additionally, how are children exposed to domestic violence? So when we think of children in domestic violence, what probably first comes to mind is children witnessing, being physically present for violence. So things like hearing the threats of violence or actually hearing and seeing the violence. That does happen, but we also want to broaden our understanding of what this exposure could look like. When children hear or see physical violence, another way that they can be exposed is having the abuser or the violent parent having them watch or participate in the violence. So maybe an abuser says, you have to participate in this violence or else it's going to get worse or it's going to escalate. Or you have to participate in this violence or else I'm going to hurt you. Right? So we can see how those threats are also used against children. What we often see in our work with children experiencing domestic violence is what they are picking up on if they aren't witnessing violence, is they are feeling the tension that's building in the home prior to an assault. So they pick up on that tension, they pick up on those dynamics, they are walking on eggshells and unsure, maybe they see their caring, non-offending parent doing the same. So they are picking up on that tension before a physical assault, but they often see the aftermath of a violent incident. So maybe children are asleep when this occurs, but they wake up the next morning and they see a physical injury that one of the parent has, or they see the destruction of property in the household afterwards. We also know that children are sometimes denied care because a parent is injured or depressed. We'll talk about that a little bit more on the next slide. We also see that children have their relationship with the non-violent parent undermined. So often children are told that they have to take sides. Maybe the violent parent sends them messages that the other parent doesn't care about them or doesn't love them, and that they shouldn't be spending time with that other parent. So they are often put in the middle, right, and receive these messages from the violent parent. We also know that children can be taken hostage as a way for the victim to be forced to return home. And we also know that children experience domestic violence and are exposed by having the loss of a parent due to a murder or a suicide. Here in Connecticut, we average annually around 14 domestic violence homicides. So domestic violence is lethal and deadly, and children experience that sometimes through the loss of a parent. So as we continue through this program, we really want to remember that we are not just talking about children witnessing physical violence. We are talking about them picking up on these dynamics that are happening through the household, these patterns of behaviors, and how they are often actively interpreting and actively witnessing and understanding what is going on around them. And talking about child neglect and domestic violence, there is an intersection. And so we know that domestic violence can interfere with both parents' ability to parent to such a degree that the children may be neglected or abused. And this can come through parents' failure to act or omission of a child's basic needs. And so often parents are overwhelmed, particularly the non-offending caring parent is overwhelmed by the trauma and what is happening in their house, that sometimes they can't attend to their child's basic needs. So some examples of neglect would be nutritional neglect, so lack of food for children or lack of appropriate food for children, inappropriate housing or inappropriate clothing, and then neglect through education or medical needs. So perhaps a child is reliant on their parents to bring them to school, and after there is an incident, the parent who typically drives them cannot do so. They are injured, they are depressed, they are overwhelmed, and so possibly that child maybe not be going to school because of that. I would say the one we see the most in our work at DVCC would be medical neglect. And this really ties into that financial abuse that I talked about earlier, because victims don't have the financial resources to pay for all of their children's medical needs. Or we know that children rely on their parents to transport them to medical appointments, right? And so we often see the lack of getting children the medical care that they need. So again, we do see this intersection of child neglect and domestic violence. And it should be obvious that domestic violence changes family relationships. This is going to change the dynamics in the household. And so children can respond in many different ways, and Liz will really go into that impact and how children can respond. But a few ways is they often try to protect the abused parent, or they try to comfort the abused parent. Children often try to fix their family and try to fix what's happening in the household, or they have anger towards an abusive parent, or they have anger towards the abused parent. Children sometimes are angry that their abused parent is allowing this to happen. Right? So instead of being angry at the offending parent, they're actually more angry at the parent who is the victim, who's allowing this to happen. So children often have really complex feelings about what is happening. Great. Now I'm going to send this over to Liz, and she's going to talk a little bit more about the factors that impact children and dive a little bit deeper.
Thanks, Anne. My name is Liz Medunio, and I'm the owner and a clinician at Aspire Counseling, which is right here in Westport. I'm going to recap what Anne said, because I think that this really sums up a lot of the parts that she was talking about. When children are experiencing this violence in the home, there's some general aspects to look at: the proximity of the violence, how close it is to them. Is this happening when they're at home? Is this happening when they're at school or sleeping? The types and severity of the violence. Is this something that is verbal violence, or are there types of violence where they're witnessing physical violence? Or Anne even mentioned the fatalities that happen from domestic violence. Where are they witnessing these things? Relationships with the people that are involved in the violence. So just like Anne was saying, feeling certain ways about the perpetrator or the victim. What are their relationships with these people? Is it a stepfather? Is it a person that was introduced to the family dynamic later? Is it two biological parents? What is the relationship that the kids are seeing? And then the impacts of the violence. Are they unable to get to medical appointments? Are their parents unable to get to work? Are they held from school? Are there truancy issues because the violence is happening and it's impacting the child in those kinds of ways? So these are really important factors to think about. And these are a lot of the factors that we think about as clinicians when working with these kids and with the families. We could jump over to the next slide. So domestic violence, I'm going to talk a little bit about how we see it across the lifespan and how domestic violence that children witness can impact them all the way until they're adults. So even when a mother is pregnant with a baby, the impacts of violence can impact the child. One of the biggest things that we see is the release of cortisol. And this is not only not good for the mom who's pregnant, but also it's impacting the development of her unborn baby. And it impacts the parts of the body, like the central nervous system that controls most functioning in the body. The central nervous system goes from the brain through your spinal cord. The autonomic nervous system is the parts of the body that control, that are the parts of our body we don't necessarily control on our own, our breathing, our heart rate, things that we need to survive. And then the limbic system, which is something that our practice sees a lot, because we not only work with mental health and families and individuals, but the limbic system is a big part of clients that we see with the addiction piece. That's our pleasure center. That's where there are a lot of addiction stimuli go on in the brain. And from utero through even an early age, even as a newborn, the child is starting to experience those impacts of the domestic violence. Something that I didn't include in this, but there are a few studies that you can look up. Edward Tronick had the still face experiment, and that was a really big experiment that looked at how newborns are impacted by their environment and about just right off the bat by the relationships in their lives. It showed a mother and a child, and the mother was happy, and the baby was maybe like three months, able to smile, was able to reciprocate the mom's happiness and felt safe and point, when 4 or 5 months, 6 months, able to point. You're seeing this interaction between the child and the parent right from a young age. And the mom is asked to then change her face from happy to just a still face, make no gestures, make no smiles to the baby, just be a still face. And the baby falls apart. Why is mom not looking? Why is mom not looking when I'm pointing at? Why is mom not smiling at me? So you can understand that children right from a young age are starting to grasp the world around them from the relationships that they have with the people in their lives. And if we go over to the next page, we'll see that more. These are right from birth. Our children are looking to us to take care of us. And when a parent is impacted by domestic violence, sometimes that impacts the relationship that they're giving, the ability they're able to give that relationship to the child. So when a caregiver struggles to regulate self, this impacts attachment and an understanding of healthy relationships. And what we see a lot as clinicians, again, are these attachments, and how an inability to form healthy attachments as young children impacts their lives, can impact their lives into adulthood. Children can also learn to use dissociative behaviors to cope. Dissociations or dissociative behaviors are basically when a child sometimes is living in an environment that is unsafe or scary, and they use their imagination to go someplace safer in their mind. So mom and dad might be fighting in front of me, but I can use my mind to go to my safe place. And as a child, this can be, for a lot of these kids, the only ability or only control they have over a situation that has so little control for them. The concern about this is that these coping skills often sometimes can lead into unhealthy coping skills as adults. And dissociations can be where people kind of phase, like they just kind of space out. So situations where they might be driving and they've had so much trauma as a kid that they space out and land someplace that they didn't even want to go, or they have experiences where they lose space and time. So they find themselves in another room. It's 3 hours later, they don't know where the time went. So these we see with individuals who have really, really extensive trauma histories as kids. And it's usually goes back to abuse to the child or witnessed abuse. This can also, domestic violence can also impact the child's development in their sense of self, who they are, their ability to integrate experiences, and their ability to understand the world and social relationships. The caregiver's trauma can impact adult children. A person who has a caregiver with untreated trauma as an adult can be more prone to PTSD and other mental health disorders, can struggle to repair relationships, can struggle with overall relationships, unintentionally bring out negative behaviors in others. They may be more emotionally detached. This is that emotional detachment is usually due to that inability to learn attachment as a child. And then they're more prone to dissociating as an adult as well. On the next few slides, we're going to go into the ACEs, which stands for Adverse Childhood Experience Study. And this was created, this stemmed out of the Center for Disease Control and the Kaiser Permanente Healthcare Organization in California. In 1995, they started to dig a little bit deeper into how these adverse childhood experiences impacted people into adulthood. And it basically looks at 3 categories. So the study itself, we're going to go through some of the questions, but the questions, there's 10 questions and they're split up into 3 categories. So abuse, questions like, have you experienced physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, neglect, physical or emotional neglect, and then household dysfunction, which is where a lot of the domestic violence questions fall in. Like, did a caregiver struggle with mental illness? Were they incarcerated? Was a mother treated violently? Was there substance abuse or divorce in the family? And if you go to the next slide, I can show you some of the questions. So the questionnaire, you can see these are the actual 10 questions. The rest are on the next slide, but they go through different things. Can you just go back one more time, Anne? Sorry. So for instance, did a parent or other adult in the household often or very often swear at you, insult you, put you down, or humiliate you, or act in a way that made you feel afraid that you might be physically hurt? A lot of the questions are direct questions about the person themselves, but the questions that I highlighted in red were specifically about the relationships on the outside of them that impact them. So did you often or very often feel that your family didn't look out for each other, feel close to each other, or support each other? And on the next page, were your parents divorced or separated? Was your mother or stepmother often or very often pushed, grabbed, slapped, or had something thrown at her? Or sometimes, often, or very often kicked, bitten, hit with a fist, or hit with something hard, or ever repeatedly hit at least a few times or threatened with a gun or knife? So that is a very specific question of domestic violence. And then did a household member ever go to prison, which is often a result of domestic violence, or the divorce and separation, a result of domestic violence. So the ACEs study asks these 10 questions, and each question that a person, an individual answers yes to makes them more at risk for other long-term outcomes. So 0 to 4+ ACEs is an increased risk for other disorders in their lifetime. So the long-term impacts, there have been studies. The ACEs study has been used in several different experiments. It's really helped a lot of the mental health and substance abuse field trace where a lot of these behaviors are coming from. And these are just some of the long-term impacts of that have been studied. Loss of physical activity, smoking, alcoholism, drug use, missed work days, severe obesity, diabetes, depression, suicide, STDs, heart disease, cancer, stroke, COPD, and broken bones. And if we go to the next page, these are just some of the studies that were done, and these were all taken from the original 1995 study. One of them, the COPD, is just to show that there's medical conditions. The drugs have had drug problems, show that there's addiction and substance abuse. And then there's two studies that directly relate to mental health. And you can see that as the number of ACEs increases from 0 to 1, 2, 3, and 4 plus, the chances of getting these disorders also equally increases. Some of the studies, like the underlying chronic depression study in the lower left corner, will separate it by men and women. And the other studies just are both men and women. And it's always interesting, and I find as a social worker that a lot of times there's a lower number for men with these studies. And when I was in school, there is some things that can be attributed to the stigma of mental health, especially in men coming out and talking about these things. But I would, a lot of times as well, women, there's people underreport, people overreport. So sometimes these are the best look that we have at these different disorders, but I would imagine that some of these numbers would be even higher. On the next slide, this directly has to do with domestic violence. So like Anne was saying before, if we look at the ACEs score for both men and women, they both have a greater chance of, the higher the ACEs score, being either victims or perpetrators of domestic abuse in their adult lives. Okay. I have a little video that I wanted to show everybody because sometimes these are the stories that as therapists, as clinicians, we'll hear. And I feel like it has such a human component to just listening to what a child's perspective is like. Because as adults, we see the statistics and we see the outcomes, but it definitely is so much different for a child that doesn't have the books and the knowledge and the insight and the statistics and all the resources. It's just pure and innocent, and it's scary for them. So I'm going to play this video for everyone just to listen. It's about 1.5 minutes. If it's hard to listen to, you can also press mute or leave the webinar briefly. And I don't think the volume's on.
My stepdad hit my mom, and he hit me, and he hit.
Sorry about that.
I was 14. My stepdad hit my mom, and he hit me. My mom handed me the phone and told me to call the police. We went to his house. Then my mom got mad at me and said we could have figured it out on our own. That's the first time I went to a shelter.
And Dad pushed my mom, and we said the F word, the A word, and the S word. It made me sad and mad and very, very scared. My dad was pushing my mom halfway over the balcony. There was cement on the bottom. Mom called the police on him because he kept screaming at her, calling her bad names. This is everybody yelling. So my mom, she used to be friends with my dad, but not anymore because he hit her. My dad's and mom's are like being like scary daddy monster. He was drinking too much. He was smashing things. When I was a baby, when mommy and daddy broke up 4 times.
So I think that, you know, sometimes listening to it from a child's perspective, it's really so scary for them. And we'll talk more about this, but pictures and talking about these things and finding a safe spot to express themselves. I know the words and the pictures were really, I think they're really graphic, you know, how they depict this violence that they're seeing on a regular basis, that it really shows how they're viewing the world. The symptoms that you see in children differ. This is the whole chart. We'll zoom in just a minute, but differ from infant to adolescent, as you can imagine. And it impacts children in so many different ways that they express these symptoms in behavioral, social, emotional, and psychological and cognitive ways. So, you know, from infants, we see things like they're being fussy, their decreased responsiveness, trouble sleeping, trouble eating. In school-age children, we'll see aggression, behavior problems, regressive behaviors, yelling, irritability, trouble sleeping. School-age kids, aggression again, conduct problems, disobedience. And we look at these kids sometimes and you know, these are the kids sometimes that are, maybe they're the kids that are bullying at school. And, you know, bullying, there's a lot of anti-bullying. Sometimes these things are so much more than the bullying, or so much more than their behaviors, that these aggressive tendencies, sometimes these are things that are witnessed at home. And again, the way Anne said it, and the way that I explained the dissociations, there's such a power dynamic at home. The kids really have no power and control over these situations. And sometimes they're reenacting these behaviors, or sometimes they are exerting control over others. And we're seeing that it's so much more than just the behaviors that are coming out, but this deep rooted problem at home. And again, adolescence, the dating violence, the delinquency, the running away, the truancy, early sexual activity. A lot of these things almost become power and control dynamics later in life for them. We've talked about attachment disorders, so attachment not being met as infants, which then goes through their life. If you can't attach as a child to the people that you identify as your caregivers, or you're witnessing unhealthy relationships between your caregivers, oftentimes then in preschool, you have trouble relating to peers. You have anxiety around new people. You know, attachment starts from your caregivers, and then you start to trust your maybe your grandparents, and then maybe your teachers, and it starts to ripple out about the people that you can trust. But if you can't trust the people right at the middle, it makes it a lot harder as we go out further. So fewer relationships, and again, adolescence dating violence. So the last part, bottom part, again, these are a lot of the same things that we were talking about. And we're going to talk a little bit about PTSD, and it's on the slide a few times. And we heard the fear and the anxiety in these recordings that we were listening to. You know, the fear, the worry, this isn't a safe place. Their home base isn't a safe place to be because it's maybe not predictable. We don't know what it's going to be like. An interesting one is the somatic complaints. So oftentimes kids will experience anxiety in a somatic way. So like a stomach ache. And, you know, if you go to your pediatrician and you don't have any other symptoms, usually the pediatricians, you know, a lot of the pediatricians will say this could be anxiety, this could be something else. I think the emotional and psychological component of medical issues has really taken a step up, where doctors will talk more about that. Pediatricians will talk more about that and recognize that. And then as you get into being a teen, we talked about substance abuse disorder, depression, suicidal ideations, PTSD, rage, shame, unresponsiveness. And then cognitively, we're talking about into adolescence and being a teen, self-blame, distracted, inattentive thought processes, academic problems, pro-violent attitude, short-term attention span, pro-violent attitude, and defensiveness. I have to apologize. I have 2 boys who are running around downstairs and playing with each other. So I do apologize. Symptoms of PTSD, we talked about, it looks a little bit different in kids, but PTSD starts from a root cause. There's usually one event that comes up, and not necessarily one, but there's a start to this. So it's either a chronic events or you need to start from a traumatic event happening. And because of that event, children will often, like if the violence is continuing, children will also often relive the event in their play. So they might take their dolls or their GI Joes, or in the video that we watched, their artwork will be colored with the emotions that they're experiencing on the inside. Nightmares and sleep problems, also wetting the bed. Any regressive behaviors can start happening, but any of these things that they are starting to relive the experiences in their daydreams or their nightmares, it continues to replay, it gets stuck in their mind. Becoming upset when they recall the memory, feeling intense fear, sadness, or hypervigilance, which is just basically kind of being on guard. Is dad going to come home and he's going to be really angry? I don't know. So I have to listen for when the keys hit the door. Is mom going to be crying again? I'm not really sure. So I'm going to stay real still in my bed and just listen to what's going on. So kids start to have these behaviors. They might avoid people, places, and things. So I'm going to stay away from mom. I'm going to stay away from dad. I'm not going to come home as a teen. Feeling helplessness, withdrawn, and hopeless. And then denying the event happened, or feeling numb, which goes back to the dissociations. Okay, so how can this change? This is usually my favorite part of presentations, because a lot of times these statistics can be really overwhelming to hear, and it could be really scary to know that all these things are going on. So if we look at the next slide, I really liked this. This was emerging strategies in the prevention of domestic violence. This looks at a public health model. So really looking at it on a macro level and then going into the micro level. So presentations like this, awareness, Domestic Violence Month, educating our teachers, our pediatricians, having programs like the one that Anne is doing, that Anne works for, having these resources in our community. These are all things that the awareness piece, the home visits, the community-based interventions, and then all the way down to individualized treatment for all the parties is really important.
Great, thank you so much, Liz.
Thank you.
We are going to wrap up by doing a little bit more about how we can help and support. And so that this previous slide is so helpful, again, to think of that macro level of what we can do as community to prevent violence. Now we're going to look a little bit more specifically about how we can help children who have experienced domestic violence. So I think it's really important that we recognize that most children are resilient and can overcome a traumatic event with the proper care, right, and the proper support. So children are really resilient. And we know that the support of families and communities is really key to their resilience and being able to recover and thrive, right? So the community plays a role in this. We also know that a secure, positive relationship with an adult can be really powerful for children. That presence of that protective, caring adult helps them with their resiliency, and it also helps them understand healthy relationship skills. It gives them a positive role model for managing their emotions, understanding basic relationship skills, and how to relate to individuals in a healthy way. We can also provide children with consistency and predictability. This is to help counter the abuser's actions and the impact of that abuse, providing them with consistency in rules and routines within the household. And ultimately, this helps them feel safer and have more stability in their life. Also, access to positive social supports in the community, giving the child positive feedback to develop healthy self-esteem, and teaching children how to communicate, right? So on the previous slide, it talked about doing education work with young people around healthy relationship skills. We need to teach these skills to everyone, to all children and youth, to learn how to navigate relationships in a healthy way, but particularly talk about these healthy relationship skills for children who've experienced domestic violence. And then another way that we can help children is actually talk about domestic violence with them if they are experiencing it. Now, many adults don't want to have these conversations, and there are many reasons for that. Adults say, well, I don't really know what to say. They maybe assume that the child's not being impacted, or they think bringing it up might cause more harm. But when in fact, children are actively interpreting what they're seeing and often are misunderstanding what they're seeing in those dynamics. So children will often think that they're to blame for what is happening, or they'll blame the victim for what's happening, or possibly the police or DCF or another community partner who's been involved. Children try to fix it. Or they often take that parental silence as a sign that they also need to be silent about what's happening in their house, and that there's shame involved in that. So it is helpful that we talk with children about domestic violence, because again, they're active interpreters to what's happening around them. So when we're talking with children, we want to focus on the behavior, not the person. So we want to focus on that the behavior and the violence was not okay. So instead of saying that person's a bad person, we want to say how they acted and how they treated that person was not okay. It's also simple just to let them know that it's not their fault, right, for what's happening, and that it's not a child's job to prevent or change the situation, because many children are trying to fix what's happening. We also want to ask them how they're feeling and validate all of their feelings, because there can be some really mixed feelings, and this can be really complex for children. They might really love the abusive parent and want to spend time with them while still knowing that what they did was wrong. That's really difficult for children to kind of wrap their head around in those mixed feelings. So we want to remind them that all feelings are okay. We can love people who hurt us. It's okay if they're mad at this person or if they're scared. We also can talk about safety and what they can do to keep themselves safe. And again, it's the job of adults to keep kids safe. And there are many adults in their life who can help work with them to stay safe. We also want to listen and follow their lead. This is really important. So we want to start by asking questions. We want to ask the child about what they know, what they've seen, and what they're thinking. And then ask if they have any questions about what's going on. Because children typically will stop asking questions when they have enough information to understand, to feel secure and safe. So it's really important that we don't give them more information than they need or want. And understand that giving children an opportunity to talk openly and ask questions about what they experienced is often more effective than reviewing those details from an adult's perspective. And that's why it's really helpful to follow their lead. And things we talked about before: validate their feelings, explain it's not their fault, and talk about how the violence is not okay. So here are some interventions for children who've experienced domestic violence. Liz, do you want to talk about these?
Sure. So for psychotherapeutic interventions for people who are witnessing or part of domestic violence could include working with any of the parties. So we talked a lot about the child, but and we'll get back to the child, but the victim who's experiencing the violence can access counseling where they would be able to also have a safe place to talk about these things. They would get resources to domestic violence support groups, or also domestic violence hotlines, places that they can go that are safe. The abuser sometimes will come and seek out therapy to work on anger management, work on communication within the relationship. That's less common. And then we also have seen or worked with other therapists who've worked with the child to talk about just all the things that Anne was saying, having a safe place for them to talk about it, ask questions. Most of the time we're all mandated reporters. So if any of these things were happening, we would report it. But most of the times they are also referred to therapy after it's already been reported, when DCF's already in the house, and helping the all parties. Education and resources like Anne had talked about. There's groups or support groups. There's support groups for domestic violence victims. I don't know of many for children of domestic violence specifically, but there's tons of teen groups and in the area where it just gives a safe place for other teens to talk about what's happening in their lives. And then there's things like trauma therapies. So there's things, EMDR is eye movement desensitization reprocessing, which is evidence-based trauma therapy that a lot of the therapists in the area are trained in, that can help any of the parties to process trauma that's going on currently, or even trauma that's happened in the past, all the way back to childhood. You could be working with adults that have experienced domestic violence as kids, or have witnessed domestic violence, who want to work on it present day as adults. There's cognitive behavioral therapy, dialectical behavioral therapy, and there's a lot of other therapies too. But this would really be the approach of counseling. And then there's also family therapy, where maybe trying to figure out the dynamic if one party leaves, if the abuser leaves, or if another shift happens within the family.
So lots of different resources and ways that children and families can get help. And I believe that is the end. Jillian, what are our next steps?
Thank you. Well, we do have some good questions waiting. I think you might have touched on a couple of them, but one came from one of our program attendees. And the question for you guys is, how likely is a perpetrator of physical violence against a partner to also commit physical violence or aggression against a child in the home?
stat on that?
I do not know that specific stat, but it's not uncommon for that to happen.
I saw that question and I looked it up.
Perfect.
So the Center for Disease Control and Prevention has reported that in homes where violence between partners occurs, there's a 45 to 60% chance of co-occurring child abuse. That rate is 15 times higher than the average. And even when they are not physically attacked, children witness about 68 to 80% of domestic assaults.
Okay. Another one we have, what are some local resources we have for victims of domestic abuse and their children? But I guess I'll also ask the flip side, if someone recognizes these unhealthy behaviors in themselves, where can they go locally to start to go and get help?
Well, I can talk a little bit more about the local resources that DVCC provides, and then I know others will definitely chime in. So at the Domestic Violence Crisis Center, we provide the free and confidential services to victims and their children. So we do have an individual on our staff who specializes in that, safe houses for children. Sorry, I'm not sure what's going on with the recording. We have 2 safe houses. We also have legal advocates who help on both criminal and civil side, and then also a housing and financial advocacy department. So a lot of wraparound services for victims and also their children.
And I can touch on that too. A lot of the counseling agencies in the area will have someone on staff who can meet with any of the parties involved. If you can always run through your insurance, look online through your insurance panels, psychologytoday.com. You can specialize your insurance and family issues, or we get a lot of people with who identify anger management as a common issue, and then it turns into how that anger or how that control is happening within the household, which sometimes is in domestic violence conflicts.
This is Deirdre, social worker for the town of Westport Human Services, and this might be a nice segue to introduce our services at Town Hall, located in Town Hall, Monday through Friday, 8:30 to 4:30. We're open. Our phone number is 203-341-1050, and we offer short-term counseling and referrals to counseling agencies in the area. We also assist and support people while they want to do a referral to 211 or a shelter or Access Health. If anyone needs help doing paperwork, whether it's for disability or any other resource, we can assist them. We also assist people in referring them to for rental assistance, energy assistance, the food pantry, the clothing that we have for people who are in need. The senior center also has a social worker that's on site on certain days. And we also refer to Positive Directions, which is our kind of partnership agency in Westport. And they take all insurances, including Medicare and Medicaid, Husky. And they have a smart recovery team group for adolescents called Turning Point CT. Thank you.
We have another question here from the group. How are you able to counsel the whole family, including the abuser, in a safe space for the children and the victim?
I will take that. So It is really difficult to counsel the entire family together. One of those reasons is because those power and control dynamics and that manipulation will often play out in counseling and in therapy within that group. So at DVCC, we will kind of make an assessment about whether it is safe for all parties to be working together with one counselor at the same time in the same room, or whether they might benefit from seeing one of our counselors or advocates one-on-one and then assessing those dynamics and some of those changes.
And that also, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, but I really appreciate that question, because it really is important that all parties feel safe, right? For those conversations to happen and for that change to happen.
And sometimes there's, it depends on the changes and the receptiveness of all parties. So most of the time you're getting parties that the dynamic is already the way it is, and it's safety planning and it's getting people to safe places. Sometimes there's more of a progressive change that's already happened before they're getting into therapy. So that could be, it really is dependent on the parties, and sometimes it's people are seen separately. Sometimes there's couples counseling. Sometimes there's therapists are seeing one child and then one of the parents comes in. So it's really, family therapy can be in a lot of, it doesn't have to be the whole family at the same time.
Yeah, I was going to piggyback off of what Liz said. Oftentimes, yes, family therapy can be with the whole family, but given certain situations like these, we wouldn't necessarily want to put, kids and the any of the victims with the abuser, like I know Anne touched on as well. But if you're looking at it from a family systems lens, even if you're seeing, maybe the child on their own or the child with one of the parents, and then seeing potentially, the abuser seeing someone else, you're still looking at it from kind of this bigger level of how the dynamics are playing out and where the patterns, the negative interactions lie, and then kind of working with those different angles in each different person. So you're still doing the family therapy piece of it, just sort of in a separate setting or separate environment.
So if can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
Okay, so I'm Wendy Levy. I'm a forensic psychologist, and this is one of my areas of expertise. And, there's a historical context here, because it used to be that, in the beginning of the movement, it used to be the domestic violence movement, it used to be a grassroots movement. And in the beginning, it was like you would never have the perpetrator and the victim in the same room. In fact, it was, they were very, very strong about that. And I think through the last couple of decades, it's finally been that there is treatment, and that, there are some people that will see both of them. And, and then of course, there's also the restraining orders that would prevent some of this. But we've come a long way with that. It used to be that, the woman, in this case, I'm generalizing, but the woman would get treatment here, and then, oh, look at my hands are not there. The woman would get treatment here, and then maybe the perpetrator may have anger management, but not specific to domestic violence. And now there are people that will, like you guys said, depending on the situation, they may be together or not. Introducing the children is a whole nother dynamic with this. So the good news is that we've come a long way, but we still have a long ways to go.
Let's see. We have another question in here. What are the resources for victims of DV who are divorced but has to co-parent with the abuser? You want to touch on what that looks like?
I will say at DVCC, we have a wide variety of support groups. And we do have one support group where most of the women are divorced and really are just trying to navigate co-parenting with their abuser, which is a very different space compared to people who are currently in crisis, still navigating divorce. And so we do have a support group for women, particularly women who are in that space and need to process. And really, that is around understanding boundaries, right? And how do we assert our boundaries and how to do that in a safe way for both the victim and the children.
And I would add to that, this is a very difficult area, particularly in Fairfield County. There is a lot of retaliation. There can be a lot of finances. There's something called paper abuse, when the person with more means will keep on motion after motion in court, being very persnickety about, you dropped off the child 5 minutes late, I'm going to call my lawyer. There is a lot of that. And ideally, if it escalates, guardian ad litem or GALs, attorneys and they can be mental health professionals who can sometimes mediate and can, try to, see what's the best interest of the child, because the child gets, flipped back and forth between this parental conflict. There's also attorney for the minor child is another kind of attorney that would also help for what the child needs. And there is co-parenting therapy in which maybe a therapist would work with both parents and try to remind them that this is in the best interest of your children. And, how can we navigate, go above the fighting and work with the two parents. It's a very difficult time, and it's a very difficult process.
Are you finding more people reaching, well, actually, I'll ask it this way. Do any of our local resources have availability through Zoom, like we're doing tonight, or other remote programs to handle this type of counseling and crisis services?
I have to say most of the local counseling programs are offering Zoom or telehealth. From what I've seen, almost everyone is right now. So for the clinicians, yes, they're offering this.
Okay. Well, it is 8:08, and I don't think we have any other questions left. So I guess what we can do is I will provide a couple phone numbers for those of you still listening. The first phone number we have is for Aspire Counseling. Liz and Erin are from there, and they're located in Westport, and their direct number is 203-383-0501. We have a hotline number for the Domestic Violence Crisis Center, which is 888-774-2900, and number for Westport Human Services, which is 203-341-1050. And this meeting tonight, this program has been recorded and will be accessible through the Westport Public Library if anyone wants to share with anyone else in their lives. And I guess that concludes our program for this evening. Thank you, ladies, so much. Thank you all for joining in, and feel free, like I said, share this program with anyone you think that might need it, and feel free to pass along those resources. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.